Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon, we'll be speaking with author Stanley Sloan, who's talking about his new book, Defense of the West, Transatlantic Security from Truman to Trump. And he'll be doing that with Ron Granieri, who's the host of our People, Politics, and Prose series, and also the executive director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. This event this afternoon is part of our Robert Strauss Who Pay project. As many of you know, FPRI has been devoted to studying and encouraging closer cooperation, closer transatlantic relations since its founding, drawing on the convictions of our founder, Robert Strauss Who Pay, who considered a vibrant Atlantic community essential to the security and prosperity of the United States and the West. Even as American strategy and the work of FPRI has and should adapt to the geopolitical context, we remain mindful of Robert Strauss Who Pay's original vision. This year, thanks to seed money from a generous donor, Ira Strauss, FPRI has been pleased to announce the launch of the Robert Strauss Who Pay Atlantic System in a World of Great Power Rivalry program, which seeks to relate the study of the Atlantic system to our changing contemporary world. We would like to say thank you also to our members and supporters, and also encourage our audience to consider how they can support the work of the Robert Strauss Who Pay project this year and in the years to come. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Ron Granieri, whom many of you know, and who is a specialist in contemporary German and international history, and who holds degrees from Harvard and the University of Chicago. He's currently a professor at the U.S. Army War College, and therefore we have to make our standard disclaimer, which is Ron's comments here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. Before we get started, we'd like to remind you that we will be taking questions from the audience. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat. The chat is where you can tell us if you're having technical issues, and where we will also be sharing with you information about our program, such as maps of any regions that get discussed. We'll also be recording this today. So if you missed part of it or want to share it with your friends or listen to it again, you can do so on FPRI's YouTube channel. Usually within 24 hours, often within just a few hours, we'll have it posted. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron Granieri.
Thank you, Raleigh. And thank you to everyone. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us here today on Zoom. It's a pleasure to have you with us. The Transatlantic Alliance between the United States and Europe, most clearly embodied in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has been the centerpiece of American grand strategy since before NATO's founding in 1949. Going back to the Europe First strategy of the Second World War, American planners have assumed that the security and stability of the old continent was essential to the future of America and of Western civilization. That strategy held off Soviet expansionism and eventually led to the triumph of democracy across the Iron Curtain as well. Success, however, has brought new uncertainties. Without the Soviet threat to unite them, Americans and Europeans have argued about the nature and future of NATO and its relationship to a European Union that is itself struggling with an identity crisis. As the alliance has expanded to admit former adversaries from Central and Eastern Europe, relations with Russia remain fraught, even as broader global concerns have driven wedges between the United States and its European allies. Ironically, the recrudescence of Russian expansionism in Georgia and Ukraine didn't make things easier, as Europeans still have debated the proper mix of hard and soft power they wish to apply, and while the Trump administration flirted with abandoning the free-riding Europeans once and for all. The election of Joe Biden has led to a shift in the tone coming from Washington, but has not simply swept away the very serious questions about NATO's global role that existed before the Trump administration and which are still with us. So how should we understand the relationship between the past, present, and future of NATO? How does NATO interact with other organizations and practices of transatlantic cooperation? Does it make sense to reform the alliance or to replace it with something else? To answer those questions and yours, we are delighted to have with us today one of the most important American experts on NATO, Stanley Sloan, whose new book, Defense of the West, Transatlantic Security from Truman to Trump, has recently been published by Manchester University Press. Stanley R. Sloan is visiting scholar in political science at Middlebury College, a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center of the Atlantic Council of the United States, and an associate fellow of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. In addition to Defense of the West, he is also the author of NATO's Future and Transatlantic Traumas: Has Illiberalism Brought the West to the Brink of Collapse? He is currently working on a new book entitled De-Trumping U.S. Foreign Policy: Can Biden Bring America Back? We are delighted to have him with us today. Greetings, Stan Sloan.
Ron, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to the Foreign Policy Research Institute for inviting me. I look forward to our discussion.
Great. I want to start at the beginning. How did this particular book come to be, emerging from your career as a NATO watcher?
Well, you ask a question that actually in itself has a long history, because this book actually goes back to its first version, which was published in 1984, believe it or not. And I have a copy of it here, which you can see. It was called NATO's Future Toward a New Transatlantic Bargain. The term transatlantic bargain, of course, was developed by Harlan Cleveland, who had been a U.S. ambassador, permanent representative to NATO in the 1950s. And in the 1960s, he wrote a book about the transatlantic bargain. And when I had the opportunity to go to the National Defense University on a sabbatical from the Congressional Research Service, I decided to write a book about NATO's future. And I had some ideas. In fact, the concept of a new transatlantic bargain, which seems like everybody uses it now, and very few people understand where the term had its origins, but it had it in the title of my book in 1984. The concept also, which continues today and is the way that most people understand a new transatlantic bargain, was in fact laid out in that book. And I'll just quote a few sentences from that book. I wrote, quote, "The new bargain must bring greater European responsibility and leadership to the deal. It must ensure continued American involvement in European defense, while at the same time constructing a new European pillar inside, not outside, the broad framework of the Western Alliance. The new bargain requires evolutionary, not revolutionary change. NATO must remain able to serve the fundamental purposes for which it was designed. And the bargain must bring together Europe's full potential." Now, I'll leave it there, but you can tell from those few words that in fact that is what people talk about now. I was talking about it in 1984, and this was still in the context of the Cold War, obviously, and it provided the foundation for actually the current Defense of the West book is about the fifth in the series that was built on NATO's Future, written in 1984. It has fortunately become a fairly popular textbook on transatlantic relations, and it doesn't make me rich, because as anyone who publishes academic books knows, that doesn't happen with academic books. But it's out there for now a fairly comprehensive history of the transatlantic security relationship from the beginning until last year.
Well, and I have a question that's going to maybe sound more smart alecky than I might intend it to be, but since the comments that you wrote in 1984 sound like they could have been written today, and in a sense, right, to realize that we have been both proud of NATO, but also worrying about whether it's going to survive, even during the period that we now think of as NATO's golden age, the Cold War. Should that make us feel happy about the fact that the alliance has continued to survive, or should it make us realize that there were some fundamental problems existing within this arrangement from the very beginning?
I don't think it's quite an either or relationship, because in fact, the reality is that alliances among democratic nations inevitably are going to have a burden sharing problem.
Mhm.
And particularly when you have nations of a great variety of sizes and capabilities, you're going to have a burden sharing problem because every country, every democracy is going to try to convince their populations that they're getting the highest level of security at the lowest price. And if everyone's doing that, you're going to have a burden sharing issue. Now, why hasn't Europe gotten its act together? I think probably because it's a lot harder than most people imagine. And if people think, well, think of Europe as Europe, they're misleading themselves, because as we know, Europe is still a variety of independent countries. Nothing proves that better than Brexit, with the UK leaving the European Union. And the fact is that even inside the European Union, there are still substantial divisions among the countries that make it very difficult for them to do anything like put together a European army or even a very cohesive European defense establishment.
Mhm. Well, and that actually relates to a practical question, that the idea that the Europeans within NATO should come together and form some kind of defense identity has been discussed within NATO since the European defense community in the 1950s. And yet the United States has always been nervous about too much European cooperation, right? They're talking about Madeleine Albright's the 3Ds, right? That wasn't supposed to, I can't even remember what the D stand for now. I should have it in front of me. But the idea that European defense cooperation should not replace NATO, should not compete with it. And so, has the United States ever been really clear what it wants from the Europeans? If we want them to share burdens, but not be too independent. We want them to cooperate, but not so much that it undermines our authority within the alliance. How much of the problems that we see in NATO are the result of this American split personality on the alliance?
No, that's absolutely right, Ron. The United States has always had a split personality on its approach to European defense. And part of that has been very simple. We want them to do more. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the question of getting more responsibility and having more, being more in charge of what's going on, that's when it becomes a problem. The United States has always been sensitive about that, partly because there have been some European proposals and ideas over the years that would have tended to split NATO, that would have divided NATO. And even some of the ideas that we see, for example, President Macron talking about today and talking about the European sovereign approach to defense, it can be very divisive. And that's why even in my 84 book, I talk very much about building a European pillar inside, not outside the Transatlantic Alliance. That is a tension that continues today, obviously. It doesn't, and in some ways, it's interesting. I've observed that the United States, no matter what it wants, can't control what happens in Europe in this area. Europe, pretty much, even they can't control what happens, but events will determine the outcomes. And the one example is the Obama administration wanted to give the Europeans more influence in the alliance and basically said, here, take it. We're gonna step back. You take the leadership. And the problem was that even the United States saying, we agree to you taking more responsibility, wasn't sufficient for the Europeans to take that next step of giving up the levels of sovereignty that would be required to produce anything like a true European defense community. And so we're talking about a lot of political realities here. And to my mind, the key to dealing with this relationship is trying to manage it rather than trying to produce specific outcomes, because there are some things that aren't going to happen, at least not in the near term. There are long-term objectives, and certainly the Europeans doing more and taking more responsibility are two very good, solid, long-term objectives for the alliance, for the transatlantic relationship. It's good for the Europeans, it's good for the United States. The problem is, how do you do that? How do you do that without producing the downsides that we talked about? And the splits between the United States and the Europeans and the frictions that we've seen on various occasions.
Right.
That's challenging.
It is challenging, and is it fair to say that it is more challenging that perhaps people could convince themselves that these problems were resolving themselves when the European Union was also growing and expanding and absorbing many NATO members? But now after Brexit, when let's say I guess the first or second, depending on how you measure, largest military force in Europe, which used to be in both NATO and the European Union, is now only in NATO and is outside the European Union, and that is Great Britain. Has that delivered a fatal blow to any notion of a coherent European defense identity?
There are a couple of perspectives on that. One is that it certainly weakens any potential European defense identity, because the UK, as you point out, is a major military player and is not at least inside any such process that develops in the European Union. On the other hand, some Europeans would say, no, it actually strengthens the potential for creating something European, because the Brits have always been far more oriented toward the United States and toward the Atlantic. And when we wanted to come up with more cohesion in the European Union, it was the Brits that always stood in the way, acting on behalf of the Americans in some ways. So you have those two sides of the issue. And again, these are political realities. Brexit, in my opinion, Brexit has weakened the European Union, weakened NATO, weakened the UK. I know not everyone agrees with that, but I'm influenced strongly by the fact that Russian President Putin strongly favored Brexit and put up money to support the campaign to get the UK out of the European Union. That tells me a lot about how he perceived the effect of Brexit on the Western institutions and on the West in general. And I make this point in my book.
Mm-hmm. I have to say that out there in the audience, Professor Walter McDougall, our colleague at FPRI, and an expert in transatlantic relations too, he has helpfully reminded me what those 3 Ds were that Madeleine Albright had mentioned, that the Europeans in 1991, there should be no diminution of NATO, no discrimination, and no duplication. You know, those are 3 things that are hard to do, and while allowing the Europeans to grow. And this, I have several historical questions and also contemporary questions, and a few already contemporary questions have come in from the audience. And so with your permission, Stan, I want to jump back and forth, but your talk about the idea that the individual European states might have individual interests. And so if they're not pulling together, this becomes a problem. Jerry Rubenstein asks, he mentions that some NATO members have signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Or that they have to give China operating rights in port facilities. I think particularly about Greece here. How can we imagine the security cooperation of NATO holding together if the European states are pursuing sort of economic arrangements with a major global adversary, or let's say a major global competitor?
It's a great question. It's hard to know what's the biggest challenge for the Biden administration, dealing with Russia's activities around Ukraine, or dealing with the necessity of getting some common approach toward dealing with the Chinese challenge. And with regard to China, I think it is important for the allies to try to come up with a consensus approach. And in fact, I have believed this long enough in recent months to have made it the topic of the exercise that I ran with my Middlebury students in my winter term course. They were challenged as representing the NATO countries. They were challenged with the task of trying to come up with a consensus, a view of what NATO's policy should be toward the Chinese challenge. And to their credit, they actually represented reality very well and did not come up with a consensus. But the fact is that this is something that when the first Biden-NATO summit comes along, we will see how far the allies can go in terms of developing a consensus, because some of the Chinese challenge is obviously military and strategic, but it also, when you start talking about Belt and Road and port access and all of that, it's far more than that. And it is talking about telecommunications, all of those aspects. is basically a Chinese expansionist approach, some of which is actually, you could say, very normal for a major economic power, financial power. The United States has a mutual dependency with China, both in terms of China holding American debt and also the trade between the two countries. And so it's not just the Europeans that are going off in their own direction. The United States has its own dependencies with China and problems in balancing the relationship. But this dealing with Russia and Ukraine is perhaps more of a familiar problem. Dealing with China is a very new one. It does not fall under what people think of as the main mandate of NATO, and that's Article 5, to respond in common to an attack. And certainly there is no perception of China attacking NATO countries, at least not militarily. But NATO pledged way back in 2010 in their strategic concept then to cooperate when there are threats to the interest and territorial integrity of the NATO countries. And that is operationally where NATO is now. I think NATO countries recognize that they have to try to come up with a common approach to dealing with China. They also, the Europeans, believe that a lot of that responsibility lies in the province of the European Union, but there is a security aspect which NATO has to deal with, and it will not be easy.
Right. Well, speaking of things that aren't easy, I'm going to come right out and ask a question that Carlos Rivers has posed, and that is when we talk about Ukraine and we talk about the current situation of the Russians building up forces along the borders, and would Russia, for whatever reasons, internal or external, if Russia were to decide to expand its military action in Ukraine, how would NATO respond to that, considering that Ukraine is not a NATO member?
Well, NATO has no responsibility to defend Ukraine. Let's start there. Ukraine has not managed to get into NATO in spite of the best efforts of the George Bush administration. And so there is now a NATO commitment to defend Ukraine. However, there is a principal commitment, in a sense, to support Ukraine. And I think that many European countries have been trying to provide support to Ukraine. It's been a troubled relationship, in part because Ukraine is not still not a perfect, pure state out there waiting for its democracy and economy to be defended by the West. It has its own internal problems. But the fact is that Russia has put a lot of pressure on Ukraine through its military actions in recent months, put pressure on the Europeans. A lot of people say, well, they're testing Biden, and to some extent that's true, that Putin is testing Biden here. But he's also trying to make life difficult for the European countries that want to support Ukraine, know that they have some kind of responsibility to support Ukraine, but also have interest in maintaining a cooperative relationship with Russia, and particularly things like the Nord Stream 2 project and other things that create mutual dependencies there between, for example, Germany and Russia, that puts Germany in a very awkward position. So I don't know exactly how NATO would respond. Obviously, beyond the condemnations that would go on, there would be an attempt to produce some kind of common response and some form of sanctions for sure, and perhaps even enhanced military assistance to Ukraine. But there would be no consensus that would favor going in with NATO troops in support of Ukraine, even though, I don't have the numbers right now, but I know that there are US and other NATO training people in Ukraine, and that's sort of a continuing aspect of the relationship. And it's something the Russians ought to take into account, that they, in fact, there are linkages between Ukraine, the United States, and other Western countries that could bring more trouble to Moscow than it might anticipate.
Right. Well, and this gets to this larger question. You talk about there's no NATO consensus on how to respond to Ukraine, so we don't know exactly what they would do. That, in a sense, right, NATO's power its existence is built on the commonly held belief and the profession that all the members are equally worthy of protection. And you mentioned Article 5, right? That Article 5, even though it is carefully worded so as not to upset congressional leaders, that every state would decide how best to respond. But the idea that every member can call on the other members to defend them. That's why NATO gathered on September 12, 2001, to proclaim solidarity with the United States, the only time Article 5 has been formally invoked. And yet, there have been very disturbing public opinion polls about the willingness of some NATO populations in various NATO states to, say, come to the assistance of the Baltic republics, or to come to the assistance of states that are closer to Russia, the newer states that have been added to the alliance. And this gets to an issue that was raised, since I mentioned his name before, I'll mention it again. My colleague, Professor McDougall, had written an article a couple of years ago on NATO's 70th anniversary, where he posed the provocative question of whether the expansion, that if the purpose of NATO is to enhance the security of its members, but the expansion of NATO essentially brings the problems of these new states with it into the alliance. To what extent has the eastward expansion of NATO to what extent does that threaten to undermine the security of the alliance by potentially placing the alliance before some very difficult questions in response to, say, a limited Russian action against one of the Baltic republics, or an action against, say, the newest member state of the NATO alliance, North Macedonia? How do we understand the expansion of the alliance and the extension, therefore, of its security guarantee? How do we understand that while also recognizing that it may be harder to get consensus to respond to threats than it was when NATO's assumption was the biggest threat would be Soviet tanks rolling through the Fulda Gap?
Well, that's a question on which I have to admit to a certain bias, because I was very much involved in the Senate's consideration of the first round of enlargement. I was the liaison between the Congressional Research Service and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate NATO Observer Group. So I was working directly with the senators who were managing this question of whether the three countries that had been chosen, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, whether they should come into the alliance. And in fact, I was even granted floor privileges during the Senate debate on ratification on giving advice and consent to the ratification of the membership of these members. So I was deeply involved. I was asked, and I had to give support to members of the Senate who were opposed to enlargement and those who favored it. But I was working most closely, obviously, with those who in charge who were favoring it. I also had written in the 1990s an assessment, which I had been asked to make by the NATO Parliament, what's called the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, now then the North Atlantic Assembly. I had written an assessment and testified before one of their committees, arguing or judging that NATO had little choice but to respond favorably to countries that demonstrated that they were willing to accept the terms set by NATO, to meet the standards that had been represented by the NATO treaty for the whole history of the alliance. And I basically said, how can the NATO countries not let these countries in that are willing to do that? Now you can look back on it and you can say, well, look what's happening into democracy in Hungary and Poland now, and something like, and people do ask that question. And my answer to that is I don't like it, and that's one thing I addressed in Transatlantic Traumas, that this is one of the biggest concerns about the future of the transatlantic relationship. But we also, if you think about it, the strength of radical right populism in Europe was matched by the strength of radical right populism in the United States in the person of Donald Trump. And so this is not something that NATO enlargement caused or could have foreseen. And just as in the United States, I don't think most of us foresaw the kind of challenge that Donald Trump would pose to American democracy. Though that is something that perhaps we're getting into another problem area or issue area here. And that is that I think one of the biggest challenges to NATO, and this isn't something that can be handled inside NATO formally, is the deterioration of the liberal political systems, the democratic rule of law political systems that the alliance says it stands for and that is supposed to guide the members of the alliance. And so that has perhaps been made more difficult by enlargement. You know, when the debate took place in the Senate on the first three members, one of the big issues was that it would cost the United States too much to enlarge the alliance. Well, it really hasn't proven to be very expensive for the United States or for other allies for that matter. And it was also argued that NATO wouldn't be able to function with so many more members. And now we have, what, 30 members? And NATO still continues to function. And some of the difficulties, perhaps you could argue, are more with the positions of traditional members than new members. So that, my bottom line is that enlargement, and we can talk also about to what extent did enlargement cause the problems with Russia. I have a perspective on that as well, but I'll stop at that point since I've rambled on a bit.
That's all right, and we will. I want us to touch on that. It becomes a chicken and egg question of did expand that. Does Russian behavior, which makes the states of Central and Eastern European nervous, and therefore they flee into the embrace of NATO, and then Russia uses the fact that these states are fleeing into the embrace of NATO as an excuse to be more threatening and aggressive and angry. There's a philosophical question there about, should the United States be more concerned about its relationship with a fellow continental power as former superpower, but still a very large power, rather than worry about smaller states, which gets into a lot of discussions about realism, which I'll set that there for a second. But to build around to that, based on something you said in your previous answer, is this issue of liberal political ideals, and that is, to what extent can NATO continue to survive without a strong common sense of the particular significance of the Atlantic community? In other words, does there have to be an idealistic element to NATO for NATO to make any sense? Or can NATO survive in a world, let's say, a disenchanted world where it's all just a matter of transactions? Does NATO make sense as a transactional relationship, as opposed to a relationship based on a vision for a common community?
Well, my perspective is that what NATO has made NATO unique and has ensured its survival is the fact that it is not just a power alliance, it's an ideological alliance as well. And the United States is an ideological power. That the United States is inside NATO in part because of the fact that it believes in certain forms of government and that its security and its interests are better served by the increased number of countries that accept what is laid out in the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty: democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And so this is the ideological foundation of NATO is important. Now, whenever I talk about this, I have to make the footnote that sometimes geostrategic concerns have taken precedence over the ideology.
This the existence of Portugal as a founding member, right? I'm sorry, I stepped on your line there, sorry, but that's the one I was thinking about, right?
That's where you start, and you can go on from there. There are other cases when juntas in Greece were allowed to stay in the alliance, and Turkey today, and there are lots of ways that you can argue this. But the fact is that these are the exceptions, not the rule. The rule is that countries should aim for the highest quality of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law as specified in the preamble. So I don't think that NATO can survive or would survive without this ideological foundation. And if that erodes or goes away, then I think we will see NATO breaking up in many ways, and you might end up with a variety of coalitions of the willing, but you would no longer have something that looks like NATO. This would also be a threat to the European Union as well, because the European Union is an ideological organization as well, that believes in the same values that NATO was founded on. And you look at their founding documents as they've been articulated over the years, you see that it's a very similar foundation. And so it is also dependent on improving the quality of, this is where I get back to my Transatlantic Traumas book, which also is reflected in Defense of the West. I integrated those arguments, the essence of those arguments from Transatlantic Traumas in this new book, because I feel it's critically important for the allies to work on their democracies, the quality of their democracies, the quality of their societies, the values that they stand for. And every ally in the alliance can improve themselves. And if they don't, then we will see the kind of radical right populism that we've seen in recent years eating away at those fundamental values.
There was a time, of course, when NATO justified the behavior, and I would say within the alliance, when the fear was the emergence of radical left-wing governments could undermine the alliance. In those days, right, the alliance or the allies or the United States responded through a variety of carrots and sticks when it came to Italian elections or French elections or Greek elections. The idea about what the alliance as an alliance can do to encourage positive thinking about liberal democracy, because this is the problem, right? Is if the existence of NATO depends on a ideological basis, is NATO itself required to sit back and see if that ideological basis protects itself? Or is there anything that the alliance as an institution can do to encourage people to have greater faith in it, greater belief in cooperation? This is a bigger question than could probably be answered today, but I wanted to throw that out for you to think about while I move on to another one.
Well, let me just respond very briefly to that, because yes, the left was perceived way back when as being the biggest threat to the alliance. It no longer is, and you've seen recent studies that have shown that the right is dominant and left-wing forces in Europe are on the decline. But just as a brief example of this, in 1978, I believe it was, Senator Joe Biden decided that he wanted me to go to Europe and go to Italy and talk with people. And I talked with people in the Italian Communist Party and the other parties and journalists in the US Embassy. The question that I was addressing was, Henry Kissinger has said that the Italian Communist Party coming into the Italian government would be the end of NATO. And I was supposed to address that question because I was even then working on NATO issues. And Biden wanted me to provide a response to that question. I came back with a question that no, it would not be the end of NATO. There would be ways found to work around the challenges posed by Italian communist members of the Italian cabinet. Well, that made a lot of headlines in Italy, not necessarily so much in the United States. But in any case, that was a question then. I worked on it from that side, and then I've seen things go the other way. And you're exactly right. The swinging either to the far right or the far left can be very challenging for an alliance that has more of a centrist bias centered around those values. Mm-hmm. And the problem is the institution itself doesn't have the means or even the culture of dealing with those kinds of problems, other than the Secretary General, who most Secretary Generals see themselves as trying to be the person who's to take responsibility diplomatically for trying to keep things on the straight and narrow, and some are more successful than others.
Right. Well, and so from the larger intellectual, or let's say moral question to a practical question, right? Ira Strauss writes in to say that while we may be waiting for European institutions and for the to transform themselves and improve the alliance, what can the Europeans in particular, what can they do right now within the existing institutions to improve cooperation, to reinforce the alliance, both within the North Atlantic area, but as a global player? Is it a matter of seeking partnerships with other states, other regions? What could be done right now within the existing institutions to make the alliance both feel and be more effective?
I think that the consensus that I'm sensing in the United States, and I could be wrong, but this is what I hear and think probably is going on, is that the focus in the United States and in the Biden administration will be on encouraging the Europeans to take more responsibility for their own region. By this meaning Europe and probably the Mediterranean as well, taking more responsibility and taking some of the load off the United States without necessarily meaning the United States pulling any forces out, but the United States remaining in a position of supporting Europeans who increasingly take the lead in dealing with security challenges in their region. This then gives the United States more flexibility to deal as it will have to deal with the security challenges in Asia and from China. And I'm not saying that, I think to some extent, I'm a little bit concerned about sort of the war drums that sometimes I hear beating both in Europe and also in Asia around China. Obviously, there is a challenge to maintain balances and deterrence. And I think the question will be, how can we most effectively maintain deterrence both against Russia and against China in ways that, as the Harmel approach, which I think was the heart of the alliance approach to the Soviet Union, maintaining some kind of approach like that and keeping, not only trying to defend against threats and deter, but also to keep channels open for cooperation. I think that kind of an approach would have to be the foundation for any alliance consensus on dealing with China as well. So it's something old that may be new again in the case of the relationship with China.
Well, and I guess that's the question: is should European NATO members feel in any way constrained or constrained in their relationship with China by thinking about how it relates to the alliance, right? Is it possible for the Europeans to live in two worlds at once, right? One world where they claim that NATO is of ultimate significance, but then when it comes to strengthening China, which would be the greatest threat to their major NATO partner, they act as though it has the two have nothing to do with each other, and they should do whatever they can to sell as many cars as possible. How should the Europeans alter their behavior in East Asia in a way that would reflect their NATO connections, or is that simply too much to ask?
Well, the United States in this area is going to have to lead by example, and that is what President Biden seems to aspire to. And leading by example in this case would be the United States not being as dependent on China and trade with China as the United States currently is. And I think that is part of the objective of the Biden administration, is to reduce dependencies in critical areas, even while maintaining trade relationships. And say there are mutual dependencies, because the United States, I don't know to what extent the United States is going to be able to retrieve the agricultural markets in China that it lost during the Trump years. But in any case, this is an area where the United States will have to set the example and then suggest the Europeans follow it. And for some Europeans, it will be more difficult than for others. But I think setting the example is the way to provide leadership on this issue.
Fair. So there are a couple of questions out there about specific NATO members, and to a certain extent on two very opposite sides within the alliance. I want to ask them both. One of them is from Lawrence Bloomquist, who asks, what role should Canada play in the alliance? Like, we talk about the relationship of the United States and Europe as though North America is a completely different world, but Canada is definitely in an in-between place. What role can or should Canada play in maintaining the alliance? And while you're thinking about your answer to that, I'm going to ask John Curtis's simple question is, should NATO expel Turkey for its various misdeeds?
Well, I'll address the Turkey question first. I've actually co-authored an article on that question, and which was published last year. I don't have the references right now, but the conclusion that I reached was that we don't accomplish anything by throwing Turkey out of NATO, because Erdogan is not forever. That we still will have a Turkey after Erdogan, and Turkey has so many strategic in areas of importance to the Western alliance that I think we ought to put pressure on Erdogan. But I think that the last thing that would be wise to do is to kick Turkey out of NATO. I think we have to continue giving him the message that his playing footsie and even more with Russia is not helpful to the alliance. But again, there are a lot of good people in Turkey who would like to see Turkey back in the good graces of NATO members. And you also have to remember that to some extent, the possibilities for Erdogan being what he is were established, the possibilities were created by the European Union's approach to Turkey. And I'm not going to get into that, but I think that it was fully recognized in Turkey that in spite of the association agreement, that there were a lot of people in Europe, and who I've heard them say it, they said it to me, they don't say it openly, they say it quietly. Turkey will never be a member of the European Union. And that left Turkey adrift. And at that certain point several years ago, I even was trying to recommend to a National Defense University that they do a study of how to sort of abandon this US policy of supporting Turkish membership in the European Union, trying to establish a new place for Turkey in the alliance and in relationship to Europe. Unfortunately, the program I was suggesting the idea to went out of business. It was the Transatlantic Study Group. In any case, that's how I still feel about Turkey. We need to keep Turkey in, but we need to keep pressure on Erdogan and make him pay prices when he deserves it. Canada is a different story. Canada is, I like to think of Canada as in some ways sort of like the Netherlands and a few other NATO countries who are good, decent allies, who have good democracies, who are useful to the United States more because they are loyal allies that will tell the United States when they think the United States is wrong. Mm-hmm. I think in this alliance, that is critically important. The United States is still the most important power in the alliance. It is the leader of the alliance now, particularly with Biden trying to restore credibility for the United States. Countries like Canada can help a government that is willing, that seeks effective leadership to be that leader. And so if I were President Biden, I would be listening very carefully to the Canadians, and particularly on NATO issues. Canada can enhance its credibility by contributing as much as it can to NATO operations, NATO exercises, and maintaining its own defense establishment, which it has its own shortcomings as well. Mm-hmm. But I value Canada as that kind of an ally who can whisper in the ear of the neighboring superpower when that needs to happen.
Right. Well, I have several more questions here. I'm going to try to clump them together. Like Larry Holman has asked 3 questions, which I want to boil down into one issue, and that is, what can or should NATO's relationship to other international organizations like the United Nations be, and what can or should NATO be doing or try to do when it comes to not just the security relations, especially because we are talking about these ideals of the NATO alliance. What should NATO's role be in encouraging so economic security and development, sort of stable political arrangements on not only Europe's eastern border, but Europe's southern border and its Mediterranean border? Is NATO as a security alliance, are they just supposed to say, well, that's not our department? Or should NATO take some responsibility as an alliance of rich and powerful and developed countries? Should it take more interest in encouraging economic development and security along its peripheries?
Yeah, that is a big challenge, because traditionally NATO has tried to stay clear of getting into responsibilities of the European Union in this area, for example, right, or that of the United Nations. I think that probably has been a wise approach, even though individual NATO countries should be, let's say, encouraged through the discussions inside NATO to provide the development assistance that will enhance stability and the kind of emerging states that will make a more peaceful region, particularly to the south and east of Europe. So it's something that I don't think institutionally NATO can enlarge to take responsibility for, because it would be more trouble than it's worth. We'd run into criticisms from the European Union that at least on the economic aspects of development, financial areas, that that's none of NATO's operational business, even though it affects the interests of NATO members. And so I would say to the extent that NATO collectively encourages its member states to try to provide development assistance and take actions that stabilize these regions that affect our security, that's good. But institutionally, it doesn't go to the point of taking responsibility for it. It also, with regard to the United Nations, and NATO's had some bad experiences, for example, in the Balkans, and leaving responsibility up to Europe and the United Nations at the beginning of the Bosnia conflict, obviously was a disaster. And hopefully we won't face that. It's helpful for the United Nations to be involved and to take responsibility for what are largely peacekeeping operations, meaning when there is a peace to keep. But the NATO becomes more important and should become more important when NATO needs to be involved to help establish peaceful circumstances when they don't exist. And obviously, in the best case is to do that with a mandate from the United Nations, and that kind of following that process is something that I've always thought the United States should have an order of priorities, and that the first thing would be to try to get, well, if you feel you need to use force, to try to get the UN mandate to do that. And if that doesn't work because of China or Russia, which is usually the reason why it would not, to try to get NATO united behind it. And if that doesn't work, the United States should go to a coalition of the willing. And at some point, going through that process, the United States maybe ought to think about whether it's wise to do what it wants to do if it's having a hard time getting a lot of countries on board.
Well, that is always an interesting question, right? Because if you are standing alone with a position, that might mean that you are a lonely fighter for truth. That might also mean that you're dead wrong. And unfortunately, it's only afterward that judgments like that are reached. We just have a couple more minutes left, and there's a couple of questions here. One from David Rosenberg and one from Jerry Rubenstein that get at a similar problem. And that is, you say Erdogan wasn't forever in Turkey, right? Trump wasn't forever either in the United States. Biden won't be forever. Obama was not forever. That the whole issue of how should we, when we think about the way the alliance functions, and this is to get away from any particular pejorative political positions one way or the other. But how should members of the alliance, and especially the United States as still the dominant power in the alliance, how should we deal with the possibility of political mood swings, as it were? How do we deal with the fact that the language coming from the leaders can differ from administration to administration, while also maintaining a sense of the practical the value of the alliance? Because I guess this gets to the question, if I can rephrase my already badly phrased question. If Trump is both a symptom and a cause of problems within the West, problems within NATO, in a lot of ways, how should we think about these eruptions on the surface of political disagreements among leaders, different political positions, when there actually are deep-seated, both important values at stake, but also deep-seated problems that are more than just one president's Twitter feed or one president's misstatements? How should we think about that going forward?
We should think about it in terms of the value of trying to keep to some basic principles. My most basic principle here is that we have had all of these problems between the United States and Europe of one sort or another, and all the criticisms of NATO and how it doesn't work very well. All of this has been going on for all of the years that I've been working on the alliance. And I always ask the question, what would be the alternative?
Mm-hmm.
If we don't manage the alliance and we give up on managing the alliance and we say we need a way out, what's the way out and where do we go? And I've always come up with the answer that no one has produced something that would work as well for American interests and for European interests. I still am there. I'm waiting to be convinced by anyone who wants to argue that X and Y set of institutions or non-institutions would work better than having NATO, but those arguments haven't been around yet. Now, just because you did mention Trump, I have to say, in 2017, I wrote an article called, I think it was titled something like Historic Alliance Meets Ahistoric President, or the other way around. And the fact was that Trump was a real break in the tradition and in the role that American presidents and governments have played in the relationship to NATO. And it was almost a near-death experience for the alliance, because a second term for Trump might have produced that, with the United States pulling out effectively from the alliance. The alliance is gone, and it doesn't exist anymore. But there is a continuing problem that you referred to, and that's one that I think we all have to be concerned about. Donald Trump left the concern among the Europeans that he or someone like him could come back, and that in fact Biden may not represent the future, but only a pleasant interlude. I happen to think that because Biden represents more of the tradition, that if the United States is smart, it won't allow itself to go back to a policy like that, or approach. In many ways, American policy during the Trump years was not as bad or as difficult as the Trump articulation of his views. But the fact is that this has left a real mark on European opinion and concern about the future of American leadership. And so Biden has a lot of work to do to reassure the allies that the United States is back and is trying to rebuild its own democracy, as well as rebuilding its leadership in the alliance.
Is it also fair to say that the Europeans still have a lot of work to do to convince the Americans that they should re-embrace the alliance, rather than, because the Europeans claimed to love Barack Obama, but that didn't stop them from ignoring his calls for burden sharing or for fumbling the ball on Libya, to use a couple of examples.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I used to use a political cartoon in my lectures at the NATO College when I showed the Europeans saying no to Bush and then no also to Obama, but with a smile. And this was the difference. And in fact, the Europeans could do better, no question about it. And so we should be. They should be thankful that they have Biden now, and they should show their thankfulness by being better, stronger allies.
Now, that's a fair and a tough love and a relatively hopeful point upon which to end this conversation. Stan Sloan, we could have gone on a lot longer. There are many more questions that we could answer or deal with, but unfortunately our hour is up. So ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to take a look. The book is Defense of the West. Make sure that you look for it in your bookstores of choice. But for today, thanks you very much, Stanley Sloan, for joining us to talk about the past, present, and the future of NATO.
My pleasure, Ron. Thanks for inviting me. It was a fun time.
Outstanding. Well, at FPRI would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And we'd like to thank our members and partners for their generous support for these programs. And we encourage those of you who have come to visit us on Zoom today that you may consider becoming a member or partner of FPRI. Today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will be here to discuss it at FPRI. If you've enjoyed our discussion today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time when we gather to discuss our complex world. As President Flynn mentioned at the beginning of this program was part of a larger Robert Strauss Who Pay project on the Atlantic community in an era of great power competition. We want to do more programs on these subjects and along these ways. And if you would like to see more of those programs, please let us know. But the best way to let us know is also to let us know how you would like to support that work, both this year and going forward. So to keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI who make these programs possible, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.